Hello and welcome to Get Out of Rap, episode 61, with my good friend Peter Dunn, who is the EMEA Community Engagement Manager for BPA. I'm lucky enough that I get to talk to Pete every day, but now you guys are going to get to talk with Pete and listen to Pete. Hello, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure lucky is the right word, but we do, yeah.
We brighten up each other's days,
That,
don't we?
that is true, yes. It's always good for a laugh.
Now, we spun the wheel of topics because we could talk about anything and everything. We'll steer clear of football at the moment, if that's all right. And one of the things that we've both talked about in the past, and is something you're passionate about, not quality, we'll save that for another episode. But as we're coming to the end of Mental Health Awareness Week, why was this a topic that you wanted to talk about on the podcast?
Very expansive question, mate. But yeah, as you mentioned there, very passionate about it. I've suffered personally, friends, family, my Steph as well. Depression, anxiety is something that kind of runs in the family, and it just seems that the pandemic especially has really kind of put pressure on everyone for different reasons, and we're having a kind of a mental health crisis as a result. So I thought it'd be a good spot to round off Mental Health Awareness Week with just a bit of discussion about it. Yeah.
And you were saying something, was it Mind had said around mental health awareness that was really interesting?
Absolutely, yeah. So awareness is fantastic, but something I read on the Mind website was almost awareness isn't enough anymore. We've really got to be more proactive and almost fight for better awareness, but better responses, better understanding. We've got to be more proactive in how we support each other, how we kind of challenge the systems that support us. So the NHS, as fantastic as it is seriously under resourced in the mental health space. And what you mentioned to me, the story you'd read, really I think illustrates that.
Yeah, so that was I don't know where I read it, but it was this week. So the element of awareness and sharing, I think, it's definitely working. It's kind of every other post, or it has been this week. I think it's an interesting point you raise about, okay, it's like when we interpret data at work, right? Then you have the so what question, or what does that mean? What are we going to do? But the story, and I hope I do it justice, was a guy, unfortunately, whilst he recognised he had problems, sought help. There was a 6-month waiting list in that for him to get help in that time. And naturally, you think there's another element here, which is if you have money, you could pay for private help. But if that's not something you can commit to because it's not cheap, you're stuck in a situation where he was waiting for 6 months. Unfortunately, during that time, his mental health deteriorated and he took his own life. In dealing with the grief, his partner also sought help and was put on a 6-month waiting list. And it's like this tragic, it gives me goosebumps just recalling it. It's just this tragic, cyclical, you can see it there for a couple who her life's been devastated. His life has tragically been lost and it's affected everyone. She wants help and gets put in exactly the same situation. It just beggars belief. And it does raise that wider question of the awareness is really important, because I think especially around stigma, and it would be good to get your your views on that, especially, you know, in life and in a professional sense. But whilst awareness is helping with that, you could say access to services and how we can practically make a positive difference has never been more challenging. That said, there's some hopefully creative resources and some great charities out there that we could talk about as well. But what about your own journey, and maybe what are the things that have helped you, or for people that are listening who might not know that they have struggles, or what can people do? How does your story play out and help?
Well, I in retrospect, having talked to one of the first times I talked to a doctor and a mental health professional, when I got to a point where I got beyond almost trying to ignore it, put my head in the sand, etc., was that my view on depression was very much, well, you're having a bad day, there's become a bad week, become a bad month, etc. So I was quite ignorant as to the kind of the medical side of it, almost is how I would describe it, I guess. And it was that at that point when someone said to me, if you take out depression and say diabetes, and you take out your antidepressant medication and say insulin, your body is having a chemical imbalance, which is, it's not a bad day, a bad week, a bad month. It is something that is fundamentally imbalanced within your system and needs a chemical correction at that point. Of course, that's just one form of medication. But yeah, that first point was, I was quite ignorant to the realities of what it all meant. So of course, being knowledge hungry as I am, I then went out and read as much as I could about it to try and build my understanding. And that was when I kind of first started with mindfulness and cognitive behavioral therapy. I was on a waiting list too as well. The first time I went through it, it was fairly mild depression. I've had far worse depressive episodes since, which I'll touch on shortly. But to your point there, I catastrophize quite a lot. That's one of the key drivers of my depression and anxiety. Is I will look at something and think, what's the worst possible scenario that can happen there? And that will run like a film reel outside of my control, inside my head. So I use what's called like a court case method, where you almost provide the two sides of the argument to an impartial version of yourself, and you challenge, but if that happens, does it matter? To your point around so what? Well, what if that happened? Is it realistic? And it's trying to bring a logical approach to what is that very emotive thought and feeling response to something that's completely outside of your control. So I've always kind of had to sit back after the fact, because in the moment, there's no way that I can logically look at something and go, actually, it doesn't matter, because my brain's running this film reel of horrible outcomes. And so I have to, I use an app. Well, I'm not using it at the moment because I'm in quite a good space, but when I'm really bad, I use an app which you type the information in. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. We can put it in a list.
Yeah, we can, yeah.
Etc. And you type in your concern, the problem, how you're thinking and feeling about it. And then after the fact, you go back in later in the day and read through it and go, does that still bother me in the same way? And that's again, that's just like something really practical and quick, really useful. Just tap in. This is what I'm thinking and feeling. This is what I'm seeing in my head, and then I'm going to put it down, leave it alone, come back to it later when that emotion isn't as raw and as powerful, and I'm not in that kind of spiral of thinking and feeling, and it's driving me to more negative emotions. I also use, let's say, mindfulness, and that's something when I was in Empire, actually, we had a really good network of individuals who were kind of mental health champions, and they built a mindfulness room where you could go in for a few minutes and just kind of spend that time, just recentering yourself in a quiet place, away from the kind of the hustle and the bustle and that pressured environment. And that's really key, just to take that time just to be present and breathe and kind of recenter yourself, reconnect yourself with how you're thinking and feeling. And it only takes a few minutes as well. So you can, I think the biggest thing is the habit of getting out of, I'll just keep going, I'll just do one next thing, and actually stopping and going. It'll take a few minutes, but everything after that will feel a bit better. So let's stop and do 5-10 minutes of mindfulness and benefit after that point. So that's just a couple of the things I kind of do to help me every day.
I love that. And what it's interesting, you touched upon something there, catastrophizing and anxiety, very loosely defined as being future based, right? So you're thinking about potential futures, hence the catastrophizing. There's also a link to kind of and this is something to maybe talk about in a sec, around you can have these mental health illnesses and still be a high performer. And I read, I was lucky enough, actually, we've both read Matthew Said's kind of Bounce, Rebel Ideas, that kind of stuff, Black Box Thinking. I saw him at a talk, and as well as being a journalist and an author, in his early days, he was like ranked number 2 table tennis player for the UK. And when he was on stage, he talked about his anxiety and his catastrophizing, that he was considered a medal hope going to the Olympics. And when he actually got there and went to play, and he talked through the catastrophizing. So he said he forgot all of the things that got him there, the wins, the fact that he was talented, well practiced, ready, and just went into, what if I lose? What if I lose? What if I don't get a medal? And then that very quickly, in a very quick thought process, went from, I won't just lose and not get a medal in the Olympics. I'll be laughed at. I won't ever rank again in a UK event. I'll probably lose my job. I won't get funding. I won't be able to function properly as an adult. I won't have a relationship anymore. And it was based on no evidence whatsoever. It was just the fears running through his head prior to competing at the Olympics. And he talks about how it actually affected him. So he didn't do as well as expected, not because of his opponents, not because of anything like that, but because of his own debilitating anxiety and catastrophizing. And I think, that's where awareness and those kind of things, and he talks about, and interestingly, there's this, I'd recommend this, there's a Buddhist monk on TikTok who, and again, I'll put his name we'll share your resources. I'll put this guy's name in the comments when we post about this on LinkedIn. And he deals with questions. People just pop in questions. And one of them was, do Buddhist monks suffer from anxiety or depression? And he very eloquently talks about, sure. However, one of the things that one of the main concepts of Buddhism, which is probably why Buddhist monks suffer less than the general population, is because it's about living in the moment. And he says depression is based in the past, a lot of it. Anxiety is based in the future, whereas being a Buddhist, especially a Buddhist monk, is about living in the moment and being happy in the moment and thinking about being happy right now and just staying there. And of course, you have to think about the future and practical plans, and I've got to go and do this and so on and so on. But the moment that becomes more than that, just to bring yourself back to living in the moment. And it's funny the kind of different places that you can pick up tips.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is funny you should mention that as well, actually, because something that Helen mentioned to both of us a while ago was around toxic positivity, wasn't it? So, yeah, I guess that being present and being centered is absolutely a way of ensuring that you're aware of the realities of the past and the future, but you're moving through them instead of they're weighing you down. Of that toxic positivity piece that, just almost no matter how awful, difficult and oppressive something feels or is, that you should just be positive about it. And that, there's benefits to being optimistic and moving through things, but I think that almost rejecting rejecting the difficult parts of the reality of things is dangerous in and of itself. It's exploring positive emotions as well as negative emotions, and exploring your problems as well as your positives is that feels like balance, and that's probably where that Zen thing comes in, as opposed to just kind of head in the sand on it and going, I'm just going to look at all this stuff because it's really good and nice and positive, and all this stuff is because I did that previously. I would just build mental walls and cages and so on around problems, especially emotional ones. And then a relationship I had over a decade ago, that was a space that it was quite dysfunctional, and when it came to its negative, horrible conclusion, it smashed down all of those walls, and I found myself completely overwhelmed by all of this emotion because it just escaped and it was rampant, and my attempt at logically controlling it was woefully inadequate in terms of how do I deal with this. And so I ended up having a mental breakdown. I wasn't committed because my mum and dad had the capacity to look after me. So I moved back in with my parents after many years of living independently. That was the only reason, as I say, I wasn't looked after in a secure facility fundamentally. And it was you remember the film Dragnet, when they come back from the pagan festival and they throw all of those drugs all over the table. That was kind of like my diet at that point in time. From waking up, was my mum was the controller of the vast amount of medication that I was taking to kind of get me through the day. And that was driven at that point in time by a toxic positivity that I didn't have the language, I think, to be able to confront the negative things in a way other than I feel angry, I feel isolated, and that was about the range I had. So when it, as I say, flooded over me, I was ill-equipped to deal with it, and only since then have I kind of built my own mental health toolkit to be able to deal with things, which it's an ongoing thing for me. I don't think that it will ever be a time where I go, I'm completely mentally well, but certainly there's a positive, I think, in understanding that past and that future, but confronting it in a way that I think it was something you said to me yesterday. Actually, is it's a heavy piece of chainmail that you wear, but you've got to take it off and look at it and accept it, and not let it sit on you and just crush you.
Yeah, it's interesting. And again, it's that whole thing about the positive side of awareness, movements, weeks, moments, whatever, is that I would like to think the vast majority of people now will not kind of go, ooh, like cringe a bit, or go, oh, how do I deal with this person if it comes out in conversation that they have a mental illness, in the same way that it wouldn't bother me if you said that I've got eczema, or something that I'm not equating the two, by the way, but I couldn't think of anything. I couldn't think of anything equivalent. But I would like to think that doesn't happen. I still think there's things. I still think there are things that need to, where awareness weeks and things like that are good, because we still need to talk about it. I read a post the other day about someone who had thought about posting something for years and basically said they were high functioning, high performing, high achieving, but had depression and have had it for many, many years. And those kind of things I think are great, because the more that we can get to a point of acceptance and I'm meeting people where they are with everything that they bring with them, and that includes mental illness, the better we'll all be for it.
Completely agree. Yeah.
Because we talked about, like, the other one being, it's not just in a professional sense, is it? We talked about specifically for men, you know, that age group that I'm in now. It's suicide's the highest, is the primary number one cause of death, and what a tragedy that is. And I think it's that kind of, we're manly men, so we don't talk about it. We don't talk about our troubles, and there's so many good examples out there of people trying to break that down. Interestingly, through clothing lines, a lot of it's stigma. Jordan has got stigma, a clothing brand that is associated with mental health. Boys Get Sad Too is another one that, around that tagline, just starts to break that thing. Because if you, from childhood, if you cry or express your emotions as a young lad and then going into being a man, it's generally frowned upon, or it has been.
Mm-hmm.
Were you ever told to man up, or variations of?
As a child, I mean, yeah, I played in team sports from a young age, and it's a very good question, actually, because I've got a good juxtaposition on that I think might help illustrate the positive and the negative around that. When I was 7 or 8 years of age, a very old school rugby coach coached the youth team I played in, and we played in a sevens tournament, where me and one other boy on the pitch were the two who were big enough to tackle this other team of huge thoroughbred kids that we were playing. So it was fundamentally 2-on-7, and it's a very short, high-paced game. But by the end of it, I was physically and mentally exhausted, and it was only the second one in an all-day tournament. The coach's response was very much, keep going, man up, push forward, suppress that emotion, and get rid of it. And actually, my dad at the time, I thought, had initially said, he wasn't my dad at the time, he was my dad, and at that time, just to clarify that, said, don't let them cry. And I thought it was in the same vein. He said, because they will see that they've got to you. But he was also hugging me, and he was saying, it's okay, it's just a game. I know it's important to you, and I know you're feeling emotional, but you know, it's important. You know, it's important that you feel through that. And actually, I got those two very different views, where the coach was very much emotion is for other people, and you're a rugby player, and you've just got to get on and be tough inside and out. And my dad helped me unpack it and explore it in a way that made sense for me at the time as a young boy. But sport, I think, is a kind of a key place where we've seen a lot of positive changes in the last few years. There's a lot more mental health ambassadorship, rugby, tennis, cricket, football, you know, other sports I follow. I'm seeing more and more people step out, I think, almost of the fear of not, you know, they don't want to talk about it. To your point, there's a lot of people, I think, that still have that final step where they almost worry that they're going to be judged if they speak up about it. And I think we're in a place where actually there's more and more people willing to be judged if they're judged, and to challenge the perception of the individual who judges. and say, no, there shouldn't be a stigma. We need to talk about this. And your point the other day about your man versus fat and the football that you do, and it's a great team sport and it helps you mentally, but everything that goes with it, that wraparound camaraderie, the esprit de corps type point, that's hugely beneficial, I think, to offer informal places where men can have those conversations in a way.
I think you're right. What those sorts of things have shown, I think, is everything happens in relationships, and so the Man versus Fat, which is an FA-backed scheme for guys who want to get fit, weight loss, but play football. I would recommend, if you fall into the category of wanting to lose weight and you love football, go and just search Man versus Fat. And as a kind of positive side effect of doing that, the team that you're in started talking about mental health and how that would link to physical health, and why some guys had kind of got out of shape and let themselves go, and all of those different things. And it's about being in a supportive environment. And subsequently, because that was over nearly 2 years ago, but subsequently since then I've moved into a new area and I wanted to play football, so I set up I just found a really nice, there's a few pitches near where I live, spoke to the people up there and kind of press ganged people at various dad's taxi stops and said, hey, do you like football? And we've been playing for a good 6 months now on a Sunday, and it's just refreshing that afterwards, having a beer, I'm not conversations I was having, but conversations I heard near me with other guys in the team, where I think as well the lockdown has kind of opened the door for people to say, how are you doing from a mental point of view? Because we're all sharing the experience, and it's allowed people that maybe would have been a bit reticent to talk about it to go, yeah, I'm struggling. When someone says, how's it been going in lockdown, and they say, I'm struggling, I think it's not a massive leap of faith to assume that they're talking about mentally, because we've all been through it. And I think that'll be one of the positives that comes out of this. It was just nice to be able to talk about challenges we've had. I didn't feel any shame in saying, 6 years ago, I struggled as a result of my marriage breaking down and had counselling. And why wouldn't you? The most important organ we've got, the brain, why wouldn't you seek the help of professionals around your brain? And it shouldn't be a taboo subject. We should be talking about it more in schools and I know that there is a lot of that happening, but I didn't feel any shame in talking about my challenges from 6 years ago and what I did then and what I do now, and recognizing times when I might be reminiscing in a negative way or whatever, and being open about it. And it was just nice to be amongst people that didn't go, oh God, right, let's get away from him. They probably said that about other reasons.
I think we're people talk about toxic masculinity. And it's not that I don't disagree in many aspects around toxic masculinity, but I do think one aspect of it that has changed for the positive is that capacity to get away from the stiff upper lip, the be calm, don't show your emotions and so on. I genuinely think we've come on leaps and bounds in that space, and a lot of that is around being able to talk about emotion beyond I'm angry, because I think that has been something that there's been a lot of work and effort put into for men to improve our vocabulary around our emotions, how we're thinking, how we're feeling, and how we represent that. And I think that's strength, to be able to show your vulnerability, and to do that a lot of sport, a lot of male team sport is very alpha male. And, and the negative side of that is that, toxic masculinity, where the playoff can be sometimes, oh, it's just bands, it's just lads. But actually, there's negative discussion, and being able to show the strength to kind of go, no, that's not acceptable. And flip side, when we talk about emotion, it's not played down or people want to leave, as you say. There's actually that space to be able to say, no, let's talk about this. And yeah, a huge positive, I think, from the pandemic is the realities that people are more open, because more people are living within that shared experience, of we feel socially isolated, and a lot more of us are having anxious moments as a result. I remember in the first lockdown, getting in the car and going out for some shopping, and I honestly felt for a short while that it was a bit like 28 days later or something. There was almost no one out, no cars along a very busy road that I drive along quite a lot.
Thankfully, less zombies.
Thankfully, yeah, there wasn't zombies. But putting my mask on and kind of walking into the supermarket and thinking, it's really dead. And it's a Saturday, and I've hardly seen anyone out. I've hardly seen anyone here. And actually, there was almost that avoidance. Oh, I've got to steer away from other people in the shop, because it was becoming more and more apparent at that time that we'd had a view of, we're not sure how serious this is. Maybe it'll come and go quite quickly, and then suddenly, well, we're in this for the long haul, and this is serious. It's having a huge impact on society, whether we agree with the measures or not that were put in place. They were in place, and I think that was everyone's almost brain patterns and context at that point in time was coronavirus first, everything else second. It was just absolutely in the forefront of everyone's mind, wasn't it? And I think that shared experience is not to downplay the huge negatives that we've had from this, but it is a positive to kind of say more people, I think, are more open and more honest around the realities of having lived through the past year and a bit.
Definitely. I watched this Joe Rogan podcast, and he said this quote from a guy called Henry David Thoreau, or something like that. From what it's way back in time, but it said most men live lives of quiet desperation, and obviously that's pretty bleak, right? But what he went on to say, or what Joe Rogan was talking to this psychologist in his podcast about, was especially as men get older, into 30s and 40s, especially in 50s, that there is and again, you've got to be careful with generalizations, especially around gender, I get that, but there is you can say men have less groups that they're part of, less friendship groups that they're part of, spend more time alone, and feel society's kind of pressures from a responsibility point of view, old-fashioned, but shoulder these kind of, I'm the head of the family, or XYZ, and have these kind of this lonely, desperate state. And the psychologist was saying, what breaks that down is relationships, is connections, is so. We've talked about this before. For me, it's football. For you, it's your gaming community and your friends, and that kind of getting out and meeting up, and that's being prevented through the lockdown. So you wonder how many people have kind of got ever decreasing circles, feeling alone, and it leads to this point around that. From a place of goodness, people say, I'm always there for you to talk. to talk to. But that kind of, for me, that kind of puts the onus on someone who is probably least equipped, least inclined to talk to someone about where they're at. It's actually, the emphasis is on that person who says, I'm always here, to proactively try and re-establish that connection, and to go past the first, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine, I'm good. Keep talking. Are you really though? Talk to me. Keep going past the first, I'm fine. But I just found it fascinating that from the 1800s that there's still been this, even then there was this kind of recognition that for men it can be different, and that's borne out in statistics now. And we still have some work to do. I mean, I know personally I've massively benefited from the groups that I'm in, and through talking to you and just talking to Helen, and having the types of relationships where it's okay to have those kind of conversations. And we don't so much anymore, but we used to use a scale, didn't we? Which is very simply, it's a shared language and shared code, where we would say, you can say on 1 to 10, 10 being, I'm living my best life, I've never felt so good. 1, obviously, the opposite. But we would start every meeting with, where are we at on a scale of 1 to 10? And it just means the others can amend accordingly. And do you want to talk about it? Don't you? Recognizing where you're at on that scale. And that came about from a kind of being as part of a group.
Absolutely, yeah. But I guess a couple of points today. Yeah, I've been quite lucky in that my escapism is as you say, is gaming. So I do a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and we've been able to shift that quite successfully to an online space. And one of the things that came out of that was what we called the virtual pub, where actually, if we didn't want to do something specific, it was just, let's just log on and talk and have a few drinks in the process, because I'm a fan of alcohol, and
you love your beers.
Absolutely. So it was that again as well, was that open and honest space where most of the conversation was whatever, but it gave us that opportunity to check in, and as you say, ask twice was I think quite a good positive campaign. And so it was like, are you okay? Yeah, but are you okay was and that would help, I think, everyone to kind of unpack some of what we were going through at that time in a way that felt very non-judgmental. Again, back to the shared experience. We're all here to have a chat, but we all know that we need it as well. There is value to that beyond just reconnection. That value is actually human contact, virtual though it is, goes a long way to reducing that isolation and that being trapped inside your own head at times. And your other point, I think, as well, really good around people who are really equipped because of where they are mentally to be able to respond. Absolutely, there's always a fine balance between going most of the way to someone to get them to talk, and then what you do with that in that space. Because trying to fix someone, have you tried to go to the doctors? Have you tried tablets? Have you tried this? Have you tried that? Then can very easily feel very judgmental. So it's very important, I think, that you go most of the way to help that individual, and you ask that question, but you follow it up, but then give them the space, of course, to be able to unpack everything that they're going through.
Great point.
And if they go, I'm doing this and this and this, fantastic. But if it's, I'm in this space and I see no way out of it, it's, just talk to me, share the problem. And we've got a load of stuff to share as well, haven't we, in terms of Samaritan's Mind, etc., which we can link to your post when you share it through social media, about different ways of answering that. And one of the ones I thought was really good, that again you highlighted, was shout. And just having a different channel to be able to discuss and share, because a lot of people, I think, are very reticent around voicing it.
Yeah.
But being able to type it out in a text message is maybe you can consider what you want to say. This is how I'm feeling. This is what I'm thinking, and put it together in that way. But it also, I think it's a smaller step, instead of being able stealing yourself if you're in a bad place to talk and have that conversation, versus I'm going to text this number because I need to do something. It's that smaller step. It's easier in many ways, I think. So I think having that opportunity to do that is key as well. So
I think you made such a good point earlier around not wanting to solutionize, and I think if we're operators, especially in our industry as well, we see ourselves as problem solvers, and we're in operations and we want to solve things. We apply the same rationale to hearing people when they're saying, I know I've had to learn it or bite my tongue, and understand that actually there's a great Bren Brown YouTube animation about the difference between empathy and sympathy. And a lot of the time people, before you start, like you say, start going into, you should do this, do this, do this, is just listen, let it land, let people share it, and live in that kind of space for a bit, rather than going, yeah, okay, heard this before, do this, because it kind of negates where that person's coming from. So
absolutely,
yeah, really, really, really good point.
Yeah,
we could probably talk about this for a lot longer.
A few days.
Yeah, but again, this has been, we have these quite regularly, don't we? And I benefit from it. And again, it's that thing about having healthy enough relationships that you can.
Absolutely, yeah. But bringing back to business, yes, it's fantastic that as my manager and friend, I have trust that I can turn to you and say, I'm having a bad day. I am struggling with task output. I'm maybe just going to take some time, because in turn I feel trusted that you understand that you're going to get a better version of me when I'm in a different, more positive space. That work will get done, and then that watching a 9-to-5 presenteeism perspective is not a positive, especially with people at home, and being able to just have those small moments, even if it is setting up a meeting in your calendar, but it's not task oriented. You're not after an outcome. You're just there to talk. That's a really good space to be able to kind of say, this is our version of a water cooler moment kind of thing, because we all miss that, don't we? One thing I did see in terms of a stat is actually, I read a report where 58% of people think going back to the office will help repair their mental health, which I was quite surprised at how high that was, because I read a lot of positives around, I can self-manage my time, I can do this, I can do that whilst I'm at home. But going back to the office to be able to go into those routines, I think a huge part of it is those quick chats, stopping at someone's desk, or sharing a coffee, or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think it's
having a hug. I'm a hugger.
Absolutely, yeah. But yeah, again, from a business perspective, this same report, 80% of office employees are having health and mental health and well-being worries.
Yeah.
So that's even higher than the usual 1 in 4 mental health stat, right? That's most everyone is struggling in where we are now. So it's more important than ever to connect.
So we will share resources when we post, and then for me it would just be, the people around you, that some that might not have as many connections, or their support circles might not be as good as you want. Make sure you proactively contact them, go past that first response.
Absolutely.
Peter, any other final words of wisdom? We could talk about it for ages, but I've got another meeting. Won't be as interesting as this.
I know. Yeah. No, I think you've covered it well there. It's get past that first, yeah, I'm all right, mate, and dig. If you think, I'm not sure I want to unpack this because I know they're struggling, it's not true altruism. I think it's good to help others, but it will help you as well, because if you recognize some of the same things in that person as you're feeling yourself, it will help you to understand and challenge yourself on how you respond to it. So it's not entirely selfless to have those conversations. Everyone benefits, and even if you take nothing away other than I've helped a friend today, that is more than enough, I think.
Peter, thank you very much.
Always do.
Let's talk next time around this kind of, I like that presenteeism, that 9 to 5. I think let's talk about that. And but thank you very much for coming on again, and have a lovely day, my friend.
Absolutely. You too. Take it easy. Bye. Bye.